This is video 16 in the series, What's So Hard About Translation. In the last video, we saw how things and actions in our world are given significance through the cultural patterns they fit into. We also considered what people's words and actions within these patterns reveal about their relationships. Finally, we took a brief look at how our cultural patterns reflect the values held by the people in our culture. In this video, we'll begin to explore some of the challenges to understanding that arise when people from one culture attempt to understand messages created in another, where not only the things and actions but also the patterns and values may be different. The most obvious kind of challenge to understanding arises when an object, activity, or concept found in one culture does not exist in another. For example, this kind of thing is pretty common in West Africa. Do you know what it is? Would you know what to do with it? Or what to call it? While this kind of challenge to communication is the most obvious, it is also the least problematic because it is immediately apparent that there is something here that we do not understand. This realization forces us to stop and figure out what we're missing. In this case, we would eventually learn that the unknown object is a handle that is normally attached to this blade. Together, the two objects form a short-handled hoe. Even after learning what it is, though, it is far from obvious to most Americans how it is used. To us, it looks like the handle is on backwards. We might wonder why these people couldn't at least have come up with something that isn't so awkward. The fact is, though, that this contraption is a pretty efficient tool for turning over local soils, especially in places where plows and oxen are absent or hard to maintain. For generations, things like this have made subsistence possible for millions of people. Even after we learn how these tools are used, we remain ignorant of the role they play in the culture. For example, who makes them? How are they obtained? Who uses them? And who doesn't? When they are used and when something else is used. If we paid attention long enough, we would realize that this tool is an essential element in many important cultural patterns, including the social organization of this culture, as this is what young men use when they work to your in-laws to earn the right to marry. Misunderstanding can also occur when we think we do know what something is but actually don't. This happens when there is a superficial resemblance between something in our culture and something in another culture, and we interpret the latter in terms of the former. For example, these two things look a lot alike, but neither is really known in the culture that produces the other. Though both are made of wood and are of similar shape, they have very different functions, and the owner of each might be upset if someone tried using it as a substitute for the other. An even more subtle challenge arises when a thing or action actually does exist in two cultures, but fits into the patterns of one culture differently than it does into the patterns of the other. Tattoos are an example. In the U.S., tattoos have been around for decades, but in recent years have become nearly ubiquitous. They are considered a means of self-expression that people can get if and when the mood grabs them. To get them, people can visit a tattoo artist and choose their design. In Polynesia, on the other hand, tattoos have been around for centuries. Before the arrival of Europeans, tattoos were mandatory in many Polynesian cultures, especially for males. They were not done by the local artists, but by priests. They were very stylized, and what they communicated were not expressions of the bearer's private desires, but rather information about the bearer's clan, status, and life accomplishments. As men moved through adulthood, their entire bodies would become covered with tattoos. Men without tattoos were considered to be social misfits. Opportunities for misinterpretation are not limited to objects. Gestures and even proximity can also be problematic. While in our culture, making this sign indicates that things are okay, in many other cultures, it is an obscene gesture. The exact same gesture has come to mean one thing to people in one culture, but something very different to people in another. The significance of holding hands in public also varies from culture to culture. In most parts of the world, guys hold hands simply as a sign of friendship, a bit like they might drape an arm around a shoulder in the U.S. In many cultures, for a woman to hold hands with a guy in public would be scandalous and raises the possibility in people's minds that she may be a prostitute. Research has shown that the expressions on people's faces are interpreted differently by people in different cultures. Expressions that people in middle-class America interpret as friendliness, surprise, anger, or fear may be understood to convey duplicity, stupidity, or indifference by people living in Asia, the Arctic, or the Pacific Islands. Even eye contact is open to misinterpretation. Americans, for example, prefer that children or subordinates look directly at a person when that person is giving instructions. In many cultures, making direct eye contact in such a circumstance is a sign of insubordination or disrespect. Even the physical space between people is interpreted differently in different cultures. Whereas Americans prefer to stay at least at arm's length from casual acquaintances, the preferred interpersonal distance in many cultures is much closer. It is fairly common when Americans and foreigners meet for the first time to see the foreigner trying to close the gap with the American to establish what is for them the normal interpersonal distance during a conversation, while the American is backing away to try to reestablish what is normal for them. Cultures also have different preferences for communicating verbally. One variable is how direct people should be when making statements or requests. Whereas an American might say, "Pass the potatoes," at the dinner table to indicate that he would like more potatoes, a British person might say, "Would you like more potatoes?" to indicate the same thing. Whereas an American might say, "I really like your shirt," to compliment your style, people from some African cultures might say, "Please give me your shirt." When an American might tell you your tie is interesting, a Dutch person will come out and tell you that it's ugly. Communication is made even more complex by patterns that indicate degrees of politeness. For example, an American might offer a casual invitation to an acquaintance or colleague to go out to lunch or have coffee, and if their invitation is declined, will drop the subject and invite someone else. In a number of cultures, it is normal to refuse the first and sometimes the second invitation, and only really consider an invitation as being serious the third time it is given. You can imagine the misunderstandings that can develop if people from different cultures don't realize that they are playing by a different set of rules. It is almost inevitable that foreigners seem inordinately friendly or aggressive, rude or aloof when they first arrive in a different culture, before they learn how the rules in the new place differ from those back home. Sometimes, as in the examples just stated, the discomfort we feel in a new setting is a signal that another set of rules, or, in other words, a different cultural pattern, is in play. At other times, we don't see enough of the pattern to feel discomfort and may never figure out that our interpretation of what we see is completely off base. For example, in many cultures, people do not eat dogs. Observing this fact may lead us to think that people in all cultures where dogs are not eaten see dogs as we do, as quasi-family members and friends with which we share bonds of loyalty and trust. This may not, however, be the case. In many societies, dogs live in the streets, scavenge for food, and carry diseases, and are considered to be not much better than we consider rats. It is not affection that keeps them from being eaten, but disgust. There are also many places where dogs, cats, and horses do get eaten, and places where cows and pigs do not. When we hear of things like this, but don't know how these activities fit into wider cultural patterns, we cannot help but misjudge the motivations and character of people in these cultures. When people from other cultures hear that we will keep pets in our homes for companionship, but prefer that older relatives live elsewhere, they are similarly mystified. Our astonishment, unease, and sometimes outright disgust at the practices of other cultures comes about because we associate these practices with violations of principles that are important to us. It may be, however, that the values that are motivating these actions are not what we think they are, but it is also possible that the underlying principles that are most important to a different culture are actually different than our own. In some cases, a value that two cultures have in common may motivate what appears to be contradictory behavior. A rather mundane example of this is how people in different cultures view putting on a few pounds. In America, people want to look young and slim, and so tend to think of weight gain in negative terms. The challenge in this country, where food is available in abundance and lives are sedentary, is keeping the pounds off. In this culture, staying slim is a sign of health and well-being, and is typically thought to be more attractive. In other cultures, where food may be harder to come by, and most people spend their days in manual labor, putting on a few pounds is a sign that someone has the means to eat enough and not be constantly in motion. In these cultures, a portly physique is a sign of health and well-being, and the standard of beauty tends to favor more ample proportions. In this case, both cultures value health and well-being, but one culture has associated it with putting on the pounds and the other with keeping them off. The underlying value is the same, but the two cultures associate it with contradicting manifestations. In other instances, the things that bother us are manifestations of a set of priorities that really are at odds with our own. For example, on an American playground, children compete to demonstrate their prowess and complain if a situation is not fair. This reflects a cultural bias toward an egalitarian ideal and a belief that status should be earned. In parts of Asia, children automatically give preference to others on the basis of age, gender, and family of origin. Children in these contexts will be more likely to assign fault to themselves than to complain about fairness, and efforts will be made to retain harmony and avoid shame. The principles the American kids appeal to resemble those in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, while the Asian kids' reflexes line up more with Confucian ideals. It's not that the kids in either culture have read these documents and consciously committed to the principles they embody, but rather that the cultures that produce these documents are also the cultures where the kids are growing up. Nor is it the case that Asians lack the concept of fairness or freedom, or that Americans lack the concept of harmony or honor. All cultures are aware of the same range of values as all others, but, influenced by history and environment, will come to prioritize certain ones and attribute less importance to others. Even within a culture, though, most values are held in tension with other values. In America, for example, individual freedoms are of great importance, but so is the feeling that individuals should be kept safe, and the belief that all Americans are equal under the law and should have equal opportunities. The tension regarding which ideal should be given priority has been at the heart of many of our thorniest social challenges, from segregation to smoking in public, from seatbelts to face masks, from gun rights to abortion rights. Different cultures favor different values because each has developed through a unique interplay of history and environment. All social groups are confronted by the same set of challenges: the need to procure food and shelter, mitigate danger, raise young, make group decisions, and settle disputes. In most groups, solving these challenges leads to a division of labor, the designation of leaders, and the establishment of codes of conduct. In every type of social structure, the place of each individual is determined by a combination of factors, some which they control and others that they don't. Things they don't control include family of origin, gender, birth order, age, caste, ability, and color. Things they do control include things like the use of property, use of time, political and religious affiliation. Each of these factors counts differently in different cultures. For example, in some cultures, people can gain prestige by accumulating wealth. In others, prestige is gained through displaying generosity. In some, there is a rigid code of honor. In others, a demonstration of prowess is more important. In cultures with rigidly stratified castes or classes, no amount of effort can change someone's place in the hierarchy, while in others, movement to the top or the bottom is more possible. The difficulty we have in understanding messages that originate from people from another culture may arise because we don't know what things the words they use are referring to. But far more consequential misunderstandings come about when we do not know how the words they are using and the things, people, actions, and concepts they are referring to fit into the patterns of relationships and values that characterize their culture. Misunderstandings due to differences in culture can be overcome, but doing so almost always requires time and hard work, along with a fair measure of humility and patience.